that we're all sitting us more about the financing of peace building.
Thank you. Do we need this one?
Yes, yes, and if you speak, you may take out the mask.
Okay, fine, thank you. Fine, thank you so much. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me. I would like to say briefly a few words also, as you said, about me, because I think it is important, and in order to contextualize a bit what I will say. I have been 7 years now in Mozambique, 5 years as ambassador of Switzerland. And of course, one of the advantages was that as ambassador of Switzerland, I was supposed also to deal with the private sector and promote the private sector. In the meantime, under the leadership of Switzerland, we negotiated the peace agreement between the government of Mozambique and Renamo. What was after this, I've been appointed personal envoy of the Secretary General. Our experience in Mozambique is now that also in our case, we made a mistake from the beginning, because the peace process was considered to be, let's say, just a political process in a way. And we were not definitely thinking about the private sector. We were so busy that we were, our objective was, of course, signing the peace agreement, and then we had no plan in a way after the peace agreement. And this is sometimes a bit one of the mistake, because in general, what we saw is that signing the peace agreement is the biggest and the most important point. And in reality, what we could see is that today, that we are also responsible for the implementation. The same team in Mozambique has been then prolonged in a way through the fact that they've been appointed personal envoy. We are now responsible to implement what we negotiate. This continuity, in my opinion, is one of the key of the success today in Mozambique, of the peace process, but also one of the key in establishing the trust between us as negotiator and the private sector. We just recently started to need to bring on board the private sector, because of course we are demobilizing the combatants, 5,000 people. And by demobilizing these combatants, of course, we now have the center of Mozambique, basically, that is, in a way, of course, available for business. This is true. But at the same time, is a region where, basically, for 40 years, they have just experienced conflict. These combatants, of course, they go home. They don't know exactly what will be the perspective. And our concern was to find jobs for these people. We were skeptical to bring on board at the beginning the private sector, because we had no idea if the private sector was interested in entering in a so fragile context. And the second point that we found out was that the private sector was concerned about the reputation. In a sense, but will the government be happy that we start to work in that region? How this will be perceived, and so on. One of the interesting points that we experienced was the fact that the day we called the private sector, this happened only this year, the day we called the private sector, we had an incredible response from the private sector. They were all on board, but not only by mistake. What was interesting was that the private sector knew us more than what we believed. They knew us also because of my previous activity, of course, as ambassador, and this created a feeling of trust. In a sense, also politically, they said, but if the former ambassador of Switzerland is calling, this probably is acceptable or is accepted by the government, and there we can trust. I'm saying this because I think that to build a market in a context like that one of the important points is definitely to establish a trust between the people negotiating, governments, also the society, because it's not so well perceived in a poor country that you start to invest there and not, for instance, in Nyassa, which is another province very poor. So there is a need of having, let's say, creating a situation where everybody is on board. Having been before Ambassador of Switzerland, of course, has been for me a big advantage in that sense. But what I would like to share with you is that what is important in the context of war is to ensure this continuity from the moment you negotiate till the moment you implement an agreement. And where we learn, what we learned was that this relation between the negotiators and governments and private sector, to make it better or to make it easier, need to start before signing. Before signing the agreement, we should start to take on board the private sector before the signature. I would say most of time we are so much focused in signing that we are all working in clusters, and we forget that this kind of relation, this kind of let's say way to share, need to start very much in advance. This was what I wanted to say for the beginning, and ready to answer and to share with you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Menzoni. Mr. Venman, you are the Director for Strategic Partnership of the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, and Senior Researcher at the Institute's Center on Conflict Development and Peacebuilding. You work on the economic dimension of violent conflict, peace processes, and political transitions. Can you elaborate, Mr. Menzoni already said a bit about that, of the role of the different actors, private actors and public actors, the role they have to play in financing peace building, and where we stand now in this situation?
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, for the question. Before I'm going to get to the question, let me also extend a word of thanks to Sandrine and you in the preparation for the event, and just also emphasize again the importance of having that conversation here in Geneva. Not only is it Geneva Finance, Geneva Peace, but also the Geneva Trade. There is an initiative on Trade for Peace, which the World Trade Organization sitting in the back is launching. We have the World of Employment in Geneva. So there are really a lot of different entry points to have that conversation. And it's very good we can start this at Building Bridges here today. Now, on your question, I think there is an absolute mismatch between, in various ways, that is surrounding this issue of peace finance. Mismatch also being a topic of Building Bridges itself. There is one mismatch, which is that many different constituencies that work on peace, as you possibly can attest to from Mozambique, but also other places, their work still very much divided in different categories and silos. So if you want to do peace finance or working on private sector peace building in specific places, the first role is to start bridging the vocabulary, because many different actors in this field are not really speaking the same language. And this is exactly where, again, the talk on Building Bridges is so important, to have this work on peace finance being really co-created. Because at the moment, this is really an evolving new field of activity, from which we are going to hear three important projects now. Now, this also relates to something where I put my academic hat out for the moment and speak to you from an academic point of view, where we are on the major trends that the issues of peace finance connects to. And here comes in the second mismatch, which is on the ever-growing demand for resources for peace building work, and the ever-growing dwindling resources of governments to pay for this. So there is a mismatch between the challenges out there and the ability through donor financing, to keep up the peace building work. There is also a certain degree of sense that the problems which are out there are in fact systemic problems. They are of a complex nature, and hence the traditional notion of going from a project that is implemented that creates impact, that doesn't necessarily hold anymore, because we really need to work as sectors together and work towards this so-called collective impact. Only businesses will not be able to do a peace impact. Only peace people will not be able to do the most peace impact, but it's the collectivity that can. And finally, of course, the trend in business is that most people live in pretty complex environments. So if you're looking for new markets, you need to engage in complex markets in a different way. These are, I think, some of the major trends why we have here today these three different initiatives on peace finance, because there is a lot of innovation that is taking place in this field in order to deal with these three major trends. Now, I think what is important for the discussion going forward is that we very clearly understand how this innovation and these initiatives are different and also complementary. No? There are some that are really trying to deal with a mismatch, to infuse more resources into peace-building activities. Then there are yet other initiatives that are focusing on the company, the corporation, and how it behaves in a difficult environment that can make the impact. So really focusing on the investment vehicle, the company, and how it shapes the environment in which it operates. And finally, it's the way of working through markets, creating new markets, creating market dynamics, so that you can, as you just said, Mirko, create new jobs and shift from aid to trade and economic development. So these are, I think, all different areas where then, of course, different initiatives and different actors have different comparative advantages. Here, particularly, what has always been a problem on mobilizing real peace impacts, and I see your eyes, you say, Achim, you have to stop, and I will stop, is how do you access those spaces that are most difficult to access for even international organizations or governments? And there in Geneva, and I come and close with this, we have this tremendous comparative advantage to have a set of actors in the peace field that are uniquely strategically positioned to access some of the most difficult markets possible, because they are there already facilitating peace agreements, doing violence reduction effort, being in touch with civil society communities and so forth, and that making that linkage work, that is, I think, the value, and that gives prospect of peace finance in Geneva and, of course, elsewhere as well. So I stop with these reflections and look forward to learning more, of course, about all the different innovations which are coming up.
Thank you very much, Hakim. So you've talked a bit about this initiative. Now let's listen to them directly. So please, I will invite on the floor the leader of these four initiatives. Now we'll start by introducing Julie Mondoyan, who's working closely with Liam Foran, the CEO and co-founder of the Peace Dividend Initiative, who couldn't make it here today. The Peace Dividend Initiative is the world's first peace accelerator dedicated to harnessing market forces for peace. And we really thank Julie to make it here today instead of Liam at the last minute call. So thank you very much for being here. So you will soon launch a market-based investment solution. And we would like to hear first how this investment solution is built, what are the mechanisms, and second, what it is its role in bridging the gap between investors and the peace sectors.
Let me remove my mask first. Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Thank you very much for your kind words. I think maybe I'll give some elements of context, because the Peace Dividend Initiative is a very new organization. It's the first time I think we're really going public. So I'm very sorry that Liam couldn't join us. But I'll give a few words of introduction to explain the two launches we're talking about. The first one is the launch of the foundation, the Peace Dividend Initiative, and then I'll deep dive on the investment mechanism that you referred to. The Peace Dividend Initiative started as an idea during a World Economic Forum annual meeting a few years back, which was attended by Liam Foran, who was working there, our co-founder and CEO, where he realized that there was a very strong demand from actors in 4 to 5, like 6 countries that were affected by war who were asking for economic and financial support from the World Economic Forum then to support their reintegration. Liam Forum, in collaboration with the HD Center, took this idea forward and studied how participated in incubating this idea, designing a mechanism to specifically address this problem, this challenge that was highlighted by former combatants during this annual meeting. He worked with the HD team together with a team of advisors, among which Hakim, who is here, to understand why there was a gap between peace and the finance world in those contexts, particularly for entrepreneurs and particularly for former combatants trying to reintegrate into formal economies. This has been done through a few pilot projects, notably in Colombia, in the southern Philippines, in the Ukraine, where a series of dialogue and prototype projects, so projects that were incubated as businesses, have helped us understand why this gap happened and how PDI could be designed as an organization to address this gap specifically. The result of this incubation and prototype phase has led us to design a very nimble operational mechanism in the service of peace, so in the service of my, I don't know if I can say colleagues on the floor, but who are also working with peace. In the case of the UNPBF, we are collaborating on a project, so we can definitely say so, as a nimble operational mechanism in the service of peace, set up as a peace accelerator. So really harnessing ideas that had been taking root in the entrepreneurial ecosystem world and applying them to peace. This is done to PDI's unique access to field actors through partnership with private diplomacy organizations, and also thanks to the support we've received from investors, businesses, private sector actors at the local and global level to help us develop, scale these businesses. I think, Hakim, you mentioned this in your introduction remarks. Reconciling peace and economics is not necessarily a new idea, actually. And this is the fact that this panel takes place now is very interesting because, as I said, it's not a new idea. Many attempts have tried to do so. What is very important is to bring everyone together and make sure that we reconcile language. And we find mechanisms that allow us to do so efficiently. What PDI does effectively on the ground, and that will lead me to explain what we've launched, is to first initiate dialogues with an economic track. So we support private diplomacy partners in initiating this economic track dialogues to identify opportunities that can then be scaled and invested in terms of investment. The second part is to incubate these opportunities. So really building businesses that can be at a micro level, helping them scale, find partners, and then invest in these businesses. And that's what I meant by this double launch. So we first launched the foundation, which is leading on the dialogue and incubation front, with some projects currently in Latin America that we're going to kickstart in Africa, and with projects, about 15 projects that are being scoped at the moment. But we're also working on prototyping and finalizing the model for an investment vehicle, focusing on providing equity for the businesses that we're building, which is what is innovative in what we're doing, as we're looking to provide equity for entrepreneurs who usually do not have access to capital. So far, the entrepreneurial ecosystem, the development world, and you said it very rightly, have not reached these areas quite yet. I don't know if that answers your question, Emmanuel.
Yes, thank you very much, Julie. Thank you very much for your answer. I will now turn to Scott Weber. Scott Weber, as the president of the Interpeace, you're a specialist in peace building and conflict prevention, and talking about how to invest in SDG 16, or how to make SDG 16 investable. Can you please tell us a bit more about Interpeace Peace Bond?
Thank you very much. We're really pleased to be here with friends and colleagues and with Building Bridges Conference. Thank you for the invitation. We've been working on precisely this intersection of peace and finance for over 10 years, actually, with our very good partner represented here in the room, Mirabeau Bank. Lionel and Bertrand from Mirabeau Bank are here. And over the last 2 years with SEB Bank, who's represented here by Eric Ho as well. This is really important to us for a number of reasons. The first is that, let's not forget that not one conflict country achieved any of the Millennium Development Goals. Not one conflict country achieved any of them. And in the 57 fragile states of the world today, which is 1.8 billion people today, 2.3 billion by 2030, they too are not going to get access to the Sustainable Development Goals. The track record for the SDGs in those countries is dismal. And so that's where 85% of the world's poorest live. So the question is, how are we going to change the calculus? How are we going to actually crowd in investment into these societies that are seen to be too risky, too fragile? And the main obstacle is conflict. So we know also that there is no economic development without peace, and there's no peace without economic development. So even if we are very successful at conducting political peace-building processes, if we're not able to actually lift all the boats economically, it won't stick. And we know that the sustainable peace in these societies requires 3 pillars, like a stool or a table, at least 3 legs, the political peace, the social peace, and the economic peace. And that last one is the one that's most missing. We also know that, that investments are not coming into these societies because of the perceived or real risks. And yet these are probably the fastest growing economies in the world. So the untapped potential to invest in these economies is being missed. And it's a market failure. I think Achim rightly said it's a market failure. And what is being done is at a way too small a scale to make enough of a difference. Again, most of the conflicts that we deal with at Interpeace around the world have at their origin some form of exclusion, political, social, or economic exclusion, and the sense of injustice that that creates. And so how can we, through crowding in private sector investment into these societies, address what is one of the major reasons why these societies remain in this cycle of instability, which is economic exclusion? So what Interpeace is doing with its Finance for Peace initiative is really trying to change the calculus for investment. We're launching a market of peace bonds. Now, these are primarily commercial bonds, traditional bonds, investing in key sectors like energy, water, and agriculture. But where the use of the proceeds, the way that the initiative is designed, implemented, and monitored is peace enhancing. That means engaging the communities from the get-go in the process of understanding and designing the initiative, crowding in the right forms of actors, and incentivizing the right form of actors in the equation to buy into the initiative from the get-go. We've established, or establishing with market leaders, rigorous standards like the green bond market did. And that's one of the mistakes of the green bond market. Let's remember that they didn't establish the green bond standards early enough. It's only once they established those standards and got the whole industry to accept them that the green bond investment market exploded. And it went from 0 in 2008 to 1.5 trillion last year accumulated. So we're establishing peace bond standards. And this is, again, unlike the green bond standards, which are all about the outcome, that you're going to have a solar power plant, or you're going to have an environmental outcome. They speak nothing about how you do the project. How are you building ownership and involvement and participation in the process of developing it, which for peace builders is 80% of the challenge, actually. So there are no standards of the how, and that's what we're trying to establish right now. Now, built into these projects are going to be what we call peace-enhancing mechanisms. That means to accompany these private sector investments with peace-building accompaniment that'll ensure that they are living up to those standards in the way that they're deploying their funds. And all of this will create additionality. That's the name of the game, is how does this create additionality? And it creates additionality in a number of ways. The first is that it lowers the risks involved. By getting the communities, there's so much evidence about how commercial projects fall apart because of how they didn't engage with communities in the process. So by lowering the risk, by engaging communities, you not only create greater profitability for the initiative, but you also build more trust. Again, Achim used the right word, so did the ambassador use the right word. Trust is at the core of it all, trust of the communities, their sense of buy-in and benefit for themselves. But the second additionality is that you lower the cost of borrowing. So it becomes much cheaper to actually get involved in this. And through, in some cases, blended finance, we can actually reduce the risk premium for investments hugely. And all of a sudden, these become extremely profitable opportunities with much more manageable risk. And you crowd in the private sector to invest in key areas that are necessary to lift all the boats, and done in a way that brings the communities together and brings the state and the people closer together, so that are peace enhancing. So that's in a nutshell what the peace bond market is going to be about. It's actually, it's not so much, and that's why I love the complementarity, like Achim was saying, the complementarity with the Peace Dividends Initiative and others. We're not looking to support a peace process implementation, et cetera. We're trying to change the calculus of investment in a fragile state, so that we bring in the hundreds and hundreds of millions that are needed to start boosting the economy, to make that third leg possible. And by making it commercial and profit-seeking, we're going to be crowding in the private sector through its self-interest as well, by lowering the cost of borrowing, lowering the risks for them and the risk premium of investing in that country. So that's what it's all about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weber. I will now give the floor to Katrina Gourlay. You are the Executive Director of Peace Nexus, a Swiss foundation that aims to strengthen the capacities of organizations to increase their contribution to reducing violence and building peace. Can you please tell us about your role in active business engagement and your contribution in supporting the creation of a liquid peace fund?
Thank you very much. So I'm here with colleagues on the panel, but many of the people involved in this initiative are also in the audience, so thank you. I will allude to you as we go. I'm going to start with what the problem was that we tried to address, and really make the point of a complementary approach. So the problem, well, first of all, in the Peace Nexus story, as Sandrine has kindly said, we started looking into this because we wanted to be a mission-aligned investor, so we were an asset owner. And we started in looking at how do we invest in companies that are in fragile places, the places we like to work. And quite quickly, that looks like microfinance or some private equity, which is high risk. So quite quickly, we did that, but we had a limit in terms of our guidance about how much of our endowment we could have high risk invested. So it was 10%. So it would have been great to have these products around for us to invest in a much more peace-aligned, private equity before, but we did traditional microfinance. So then the question is, if you have constraints for 90% of your endowment to be liquid, lower risk, how can you do that in a peace-themed way? And even the first question, so we decided to tackle this question not alone, but with our partners. So we were very happy to find a willing fund manager that was willing to explore it, and others in the methodology space. So I'll talk a little bit about what is the methodology then. So the first thing is, if you look at the universe of companies, which big companies that are on the stock exchange, liquid equities, do have an impact in fragile states. So where they have an economic footprint, where they employ people, where they invest. So that's your first screening. Then there's a question about the products and the conduct. What do they do? How do they do it? Very much to Scott's point. And there we found the data is limited because ESG frameworks were frankly not sufficient. So we complemented ESG with a range of other sources, including filtering through open sources in terms of reputation on some of these companies in those countries, because one of the big gaps we found is there isn't much data that's disaggregated by country. So if you're just looking at how these companies perform in fragile states, that's a challenging task. And this is where the additionality comes in. Once we've selected this big universe of investable companies, then our asset managers pick the best ones, I mean, from a financial point of view. And then our added value comes in the engagement part. So really, the only impact we can claim is through the engagement with these companies to reduce the risk that they inadvertently make things worse. Frankly, it's possible in fragile states. and secondly, to improve the likelihood that they can contribute to social cohesion through some of the things that Scott was talking about, and through how they work, who they employ, and what their processes are. And this has then led to this refined engagement approach, which also involves partners, which, and just briefly on that, what it's delivered is, so firstly, companies don't know anything. I mean, they're like, what do you mean peace? We don't do peace. I mean, so there's a first, this is a new, this is a new area. So there's a whole sort of educational element about describing how they actually, what their impact already is and how it could be improved. And then we do find that there is a lot of interest because there are about 5 or 6 common things that companies would like support and guidance on. How to pick social targets, how to improve their human rights due diligence, how to better do community engagement. I mean, there may be 5 or 6 areas where we find the door is open. And so what I would like to say about this asset class and this approach is you're only ever going to get incremental change. This is not about transformation of a system or bringing millions and millions to the most difficult places. It's about changing the way impactful companies do their operations where they're actually already interested in it. It only works with the better performing companies, and then they are ready to do more. And then, but at the same time, they do it because they realize their risks are reduced, and it actually does serve their bottom line as well as their communications and their marketing. And I don't know how many examples I can give, but if need to, I can give a few. So that is that complementary experiment. And I want to, can I hand over now to others or later?
Please feel free.
Good, because I really want to give credit to Puripicte Torretini, which is the asset manager, Dominic is here, for really taking a huge risk in exploring this new theme, which was really an unknown. And I would like to, and say that they're actually leading in so many of these areas, microfinance, our fund, now they have an Impact Gold initiative, so this is a really cutting edge company.
No risk, no reward, right? I remember with great pleasure the day the Peace Nexus Foundation knocked on our door. I don't think we were your first choice, but at least you stayed with us. Indeed, they came with this crazy idea. We want to invest in peace with a standard listed equity portfolio. And that's quite interesting because we've seen a discussion around different asset classes. And here we loved the idea immediately because working on this field for over 20 years, we know that to invest and to make a difference with complex themes, it requires sometimes a little bit more thought than just very simple ideas. And similar to climate change, basically, if you want to make a difference in listed equity, you probably will need to be invested to some level of exposure. So investing in peace in companies that are only active in Switzerland, right, wouldn't make many sense. So we needed to have a footprint. We needed to invest in companies that can make a difference. Now, thanks to the Peace Nexus Foundation, obviously, we eliminated the companies that we knew would not talk to us because the main idea of the fund was based on our investment approach, based on engagement. And we heard it throughout this summit. Engagement is probably one of the most promising strategies investing in listed equity. And in particular, we thought it was very interesting to do that on peace, just in a similar way as you can do on the other ESG issues. By engaging with the companies, by bringing in the expertise of the Peace Nexus Foundation, by having done that over 15 years, we really got the attention of main multinational companies, Nestlé, L'Oreal, Danone, just to name a few, that engaged with us, not just once, but we had several meetings, first with some management people, then with human rights specialists, then with transparency, communication people. And this work is ongoing. And the whole purpose of this fund, for a listed fund, is also to have additionality. And it's not by investing in Nestlé or Danone that will have an additionality. It's by bringing in all the expertise of the Peace Nexus Foundation and the expertise of the peace building expertise of the Geneva ecosystem to help those companies because they are in dire need to explain, to communicate that they can help to stabilize some of those fragile countries in which they are active, to showcase that this is a double dividend for them and for the communities in which they live. And this has indeed barely been tackled by the financial community to this date.
Thank you very much. Katrina, do you want to add something?
No, I think
So,
that's enough of our solution.
thank you very much. So, Brian James Williams, I will hand over the floor to you. You are the head of the Peace Building Fund, a United Nations financial instruments to sustain peace. Can you elaborate on the role of the PBF and mainly how it does leverage and influence to develop blended finance instruments? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here. Usually I like to know who my audience is, and I'm feeling kind of out of sorts at the moment. So maybe there are billions of dollars in the room, or maybe they're not. I don't know. Anyway, we'll give it a go. I'm the UN guy on the panel. I run a thing called the Peace Building Fund. We support about $200 million worth of United Nations programs around the world every year in conflict-affected countries. And traditionally, we do sort of the classic programs through UNDP, through IOM, through the agencies that you all know, many of them here in Geneva, working in conflict and fragility. It is a relatively new space for us to try and work with the private sector. So I want to say a couple of things about sort of the UN in general with private sector partnerships before I talk more about the Peace Building Fund. Firstly, I want to get rid of a myth, which is that the United Nations is trying to raise money from the private sector. I think there was a period in time when that's what we were trying to do, or we were hoping to do, but it is not the case. We recognize across the board that the value of private sector investment in economies in the ways that my colleagues have presented is valuable not because it goes through the UN, but because it is affecting the communities and it is addressing some of the inequities, it's addressing some of the grievances that drive conflicts directly through the self-interest and through the productive investment of the private sector. So not interested in raising money from the private sector for ourselves. This is recognized by no one less than the Secretary General. He issued a couple of months ago a thing called the Common Agenda, which was sort of his program for his next 5-year mandate. And in the Common Agenda, he is very clear that partnerships with the private sector are critical for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and it is not about raising money from the private sector. It's about partnering with the private sector. So it's quite important. The Global Compact, so another system-wide, UN system-wide initiative that I hope you're all aware of already. The UN Global Compact is about the relationship between the UN and the private sector. And it earlier this year, I think in June, launched an initiative about the private sector working with SDG 16. SDG 16 is the SDG that is dedicated to peace, also to rule of law and accountable institutions. And these bits about rule of law and accountable institutions are really quite important. For example, if you're talking about private sector investment, having contract reliability and recourse in the case of problems around contracts and so on is really quite important. So SDG 16 is what the Global Compact in terms of business is focused on. And in its initiative, of course, the SDGs are a bureaucratic exercise, so there are sub-targets. And the Global Compact lists what business can do against each of those targets. So if it's about reducing violence, if it's about reducing corruption, if it's about rendering contracts more transparent, the Global Compact encourages what government can do. Just a third example of what the UN in general is doing in the area of partnership with the private sector. Up the street here, the Human Rights Council has established a working group on human rights and the private sector and the business community, and talk about ways in which you can have more transparency, do good human rights due diligence, and so on. They're obviously coming at it from a very human rights perspective, but it reflects the extent to which the UN understands the importance of the private sector in development in general and in peace building more specifically, and how they want to engage with it. We're also working on an initiative that we call a peace positive investment framework. We're working on this with the German government and some other partners. And here we're trying to think about not just how companies can do no harm, which is the phrase we all use, in their investments in conflicts, in settings of conflict and fragility, but how they can actually take actions which are peace positive in their impacts. And some of the subcategories here are, Scott was mentioning the exclusion being a driver of many conflicts. So how can a company in its investment encourage inclusion of communities that might have been marginally excluded in their work? Or how can they mitigate against the concentration of resources? So often there is deep inequalities in countries where there's a lot of conflict. So how can an investment help to work against the concentration of resources? So there are a lot of initiatives out there about how we can do this better. And a little anecdote, and then I'll give 3 quick examples, if I may, about the Peacebuilding Fund. I was working with a friend from the EBRD, who of course invests in companies. That's the EBRD's job. And he said to me, you know, Brian, when you're trying to work with the private sector, you can't expect to have one meeting and then it's all going to click. That the cultures of the public sector, whether it's international or national, is really very different from the culture of private sector. And you need to spend you need to meet a lot of times where you get to learn what it is that's motivating the private sector, their interests, and same thing for them to learn about us. We tend to think everybody knows what governments do already, but we hide behind acronyms and it's not very clear. So you really need to invest in that relationship before you get to a point that you can actually sort of make an agreement. Now the Peacebuilding Fund. So we have, I wanted to mention quickly, if I may, if I have time still, three quick programs. In Colombia, I mean, in Colombia, there's a peace agreement. We just celebrated the 5th anniversary of it. I hope you saw that in the news. Secretary General Guterres was visiting. In the highly conflicted areas where the conflict took place, there's much less economic activity, much greater poverty, and of course the risk of relapse into violence if we can't address some of the core grievances that were there. The program we have, it was $2.5 million, triggered, leveraged, I guess is the jargon we like to use for it, $15 million worth of private investment from some social impacts, from funds, from banks that invested in a variety of agricultural related businesses in these highly conflict affected territories to help get started on economic development. And in this case, what makes it peace building is that it's working in those specific territories. Companies are less likely to go there because they were further away, they were more isolated, there were less resources to begin with. The kinds of things that our money did, technical assistance, so helping some of those small entrepreneurs actually figure out what a business plan is, subsidize interest rates so that commercial lending was more accessible to some of those small companies, maybe seed capital in some of the small companies. So this is a project that we had. It was running a couple of years ago, and I can share more information about it. Just in the last 6 weeks, we've approved 2 more programs that are also working at relationships with the private sector. Another one in Colombia is trying to bring in the aspect of the environment. So Colombia has a carbon credit program. So if communities protect the forest in ways that are recognized by the state, then they can earn carbon credits, which of course they can sell. So there's a potential private revenue stream there. So this program that we've approved, that hasn't started yet, will help build the capacity of communities to both learn how to protect the forests in ways that are recognized by the government and the rules, so that they can actually earn the carbon credits, and help introduce them to the market where they can then sell those carbon credits. So this is a really interesting one. Well, certainly it's pilot and experimental, but we'll see how it goes. And the last project I'll mention is in Burundi. In Burundi, there's a national park. In some parts of the world, national parks are used by armed groups, by militia groups as a rear base, as a place to hide. Communities may use the resources of the forest in ways that are not entirely legal. So we have a public partner, we're investing in a public-private partnership in Burundi that will invest in renewable energy, in this case a hydropower plant, will create the foundation of local organizations to help manage the resources in the park, and will invest in the government's capacity to manage the park also, and rangers and so on. So it's quite a complicated instrument. It has both support to civil society and community elements, and some core funding into this public-private partnership. So these are examples of the things we're trying to do. They address some of the risks that my colleagues have all presented in the earlier this afternoon. They are still very small scale. So when I sort of think about Geneva and big finance, it's hard to imagine how we're going to bridge that gap. But in the long run, maybe we'll get there. And in the short run, we really do want to encourage those who are interested in trying to figure out how to invest in peace to work with us in some of these incremental projects, so that we can experiment and learn and scale up later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now turn back to Hakim, and you've started to summarize the complementarity between those projects. Maybe you can elaborate a bit on that. And the question I would have is, what is it going to take now to make more money move in the direction of the financing of peace?
If I had that answer, I wouldn't be sitting here. But I can reflect on it. No, I can just be here. That's okay. Look, just perhaps two or three thoughts on the complementarity. What was already mentioned is that some of the biggest business opportunities are really locked up by conflict, as Scott mentioned. There are many people who live there, so there are really potentially big markets that are currently locked. So imagine this is a big fat padlock, which is on top of a market, because in many places you can't access. No, and here the complementarity is, you have organizations that can help open that padlock. They have a key, no? Because they have direct relationship to actors that many few individuals, many few organizations have access to. I always like to say Geneva is the only place in the world that has second-degree relations with any armed actor anywhere in the world. And this is an atout that we have here. So here comes the complementarity. Perhaps in the investment field, you think about frontier markets. Here, these are ultra frontier markets, where if you engage early on with initiatives such as the Peace Bonds, PDI, or the Cadmus Foundation, the Cadmus bonds, you can, within a 5 to 10 year vision, you can in fact collectively build on shaping the economic dynamics in these places. And we are not in shortage of places to look for. No, I think between Interpeace, the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, and many others, in particular the UN, one looks possibly about over 150 places where there are possibilities to unlock these padlocks. So this is one complementarity. The other complementarity is about reaching out to people, because of course you do not want to only do this development for far away, for very abstract kind of money making, but you want to make sure communities benefit. And here comes also the possibility for some of the complementarity to leverage the connectedness to the community-based organizations, to different sets of government, not just the national government, but also the local governments. And that's the complementarity you need in order to protect the investment that you have on the ground. No, these ongoing accompaniment mechanisms that not just thinking, okay, we invest there, then we come back in 5 years, but you have the peace community that is in fact there to accompany the investment, to make sure they are de-risked. And at least on this point, I put up a paper that I did. I am an academic, so you can read it all in this paper, and you can share it on accompaniment mechanisms, which is really really walking together with the peace community, the process of investment, and even going to places perhaps to see how an investment can make a difference in so many lives. So that's where I would see some of the complementarities between, of course, the UN peace building front that has, of course, brings in a lot of apparatus from the United Nations side, You have the private diplomacy side, private actors, because they are neither government actors, neither UN actors, but they have unique access to have this inbuilt neutrality that is necessary in order to do this work. And then you have, of course, the entire academic and peace-building world, which provides unique analysis on some of these places. So why there is perhaps not millions or billions flowing into this right now? Because it's really hard work. Hard work meaning that we have to start this conversation now, as you said, long-term conversations. It's not that we have, this is the first conversation and then all the money comes or all the peace blooms, but we need to be really straightforward in saying we need to have this conversation because the future markets are out there. And it's not just the current turbulence which we see, but it's also about that turbulence will be and is already the new normal. In this town, the International Panel of Climate Change has produced the scientific base on the expected turbulence that we will see with respect to impact on climate change. And if you would like to see more returns in markets, then you need to be able to deal with this turbulence. And here we have some suggestions in order to make sure that there are, in fact, ways of working around the turbulence, and while still trying to get some returns or getting some returns and also producing benefits and dealing with this turbulence, because this is now with us now.
Thank you. Mr. Weber, you've mentioned the huge market represented by green bonds. You said 1.5 trillion. You said it's all outcome. Peace bond is process and outcome, as I understand it. What are the how would you use the green bond markets and the experience of it to attract money first, but also to avoid the risk that we've seen with green bonds over time?
Well, first of all, I couldn't agree more with what Achim is saying on this. And in fact, the investment side of the equation is not the problem. The money is there, for goodness sakes. There is so much liquidity in the market right now that doesn't know where to go. There are negative interest rates alone in Switzerland for funds. I mean, it costs people money to keep it in the bank. The amount of investment opportunity is not the problem. The problem is providing structures and initiatives that are primarily commercially interesting, because in my experience of working with the private sector, you appeal to the wallet and then the heart pays attention. But if you don't appeal to the wallet first, the heart is distracted, yeah? And so it has to make sense economically, which means that the name of the game, le nerf de la guerre, is to really bring the cost of borrowing down, the cost of the investment down, so that it becomes, and the risk premium down, so, and through all the ways that I think everyone on this panel has been talking about, is through peace-enhancing mechanisms. We all have a different maybe word for it. We need to use a common vocabulary, like you said. But we're all talking about how peace-building actually de-risks. It de-risks investment. So if you can get the investment risk profile down, the investors are there. For goodness sakes, you were talking about billions in the room, Brian. I presented the Peace Bonds Initiative to a room at Harvard, the Fiduciary Investors Forum. There was $8 trillion under management in the room. Sovereign wealth funds, all the big pension funds, et cetera. They were chomping at the bit to get into this because these are big investors who can't move their money on SDG 16. There are no investment opportunities for them that are at scale. Excuse me. We're talking about the problem of scale. Many of us talked about the problem of scale. We have to be offering opportunities to invest that are in the order of 500 million to $1 billion, not a couple million here, a couple million there. It's not going to move the market to do a few million here or there. It's the $200 million bond. It's the $500 million bond. It's the $1 billion bond. And how do you do that? It's primarily by lumping together a whole series of projects into clusters that is first going to de-risk by spreading the risk across more countries in a given sector of work that people can understand, including projects in there that are in more stable places too, which further de-risks the investment as well. I mean, that's the name of the game, is how are we going to get 500 million to $1 billion at a time into these countries? And the way that you do that is what we're talking about here. It's through de-risking, it's through understanding, and this is, by the way, all the ways that we're talking about these investments taking place in all four examples is far cheaper than a grant. Notice that the current way that peace building is supported, peace and stability is supported, is through grants, which are horribly expensive and complete loss. It's a fond perdu for the most part. We're talking about much more efficient ways of moving capital that actually creates income and profitability, which will then you can reinvest into the next opportunity. But scale is critical. And that's why we're trying to focus really on solutions that can be taken to scale, so that we can actually change the risk premium of a whole country or of a sector of work. And I can tell you from talks with the DFIs, the Development Finance Corporations and institutions, they have about 13 years of statistics. Most of them have not been released to the public, but they're there. 13 years of statistics on other kinds of investments in what we call fragile countries. Environmental investments, et cetera, not peace enhancing, but other kinds. And guess what they all say consistently is that the actual risk premium is much lower than what it's perceived to be. Right now, with data, with evidence, it's much lower than what the market thinks. So the other nerf de la guerre is educating the market, is having them see this happen again and again and again, and have them build more confidence in this type of investment, in this asset class, as you were saying, Katrina, so that then you won't need blended finance to support and to de-risk. The private sector will be able to assess and price risk. Again, it's about pricing the risk properly. And how can you get that price down so that you crowd in investment at scale? And if we don't do it at scale, we're all kind of, this is a hobby. Let's be clear. It's not going to change things. We've got to lift all the boats, like the colleagues have been saying. It's about inequality and addressing larger inequalities in society. And economic development supports peace, and without it, peace doesn't stick. So that's I think, our main challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. So we realize that we need to create an ecosystem for investing in peace, a real ecosystem. So maybe one of you can elaborate on building this ecosystem in Geneva and in Switzerland. Maybe Julie.
Thank you. Well, I think the point was made very clearly. There are a lot of there's a lot of ideas there. What we've identified when we're prototyping and scoping projects for PDIs, there are tons of entrepreneurial ideas. There are tons of economic development ideas in conflict-affected areas, and they can represent billions dollars of worth, or Swiss francs here of worth. The problem is how do we crowd in investment? And I think what we've seen, at least in the work PDI has undertaken, is that entrepreneurs have, first of all, like in these conflict-affected areas, a very strong trust in Switzerland. Switzerland is a neutral country. It's very important to state. If you speak about peace building and investing in peace, it demonstrates that it's not an interested investment, or at least that's the perception that we've noted. Geneva itself is the global humanitarian capital, so I think there are very strong values linked to peace. Many peace organizations, we've spoken about very different approaches to peace that are complementary and that can provide access to the field. And last but not least, there is a huge network of diplomats and investors that do have the capital and also the access for these projects to take place and to take shape in those countries. So I think Geneva is a natural birthplace. And impact investment is also on the rise, as you would know much better than I do. Here. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything about
Do you want to add something?
in Geneva?
Maybe Katrina, with your experience on working on the Peace Foundation in Switzerland?
Well, obviously, our experience points to the fact that you have an ecosystem that's already big enough that new ideas can take root, so Geneva in particular is our and I do think that I mean, I do see a lot of potential for other kinds of initiatives. There are initiatives that have already been mentioned here, but there are sort of collective shareholder initiatives. There's a lot on, I mean, while the banks in Geneva and beyond are, you know, as you can see from the list here, are really backing this, I think, you know, when my experience of engaging with them, I don't want to name, is still that it's still early days. I mean, we're considered cutting edge with 10% of our endowment in impact finance, and in the rest, like, we're the only ones in terms of clients that actually say, we want to know what decisions were made on ESG criteria. And frankly, the people that are responding aren't really aware of it. So I think talk's a good talk, and maybe it helps with marketing, but I think that Geneva really has to show that, you know, how, I mean, we should expect to have very knowledgeable people at the table, across the table, on ESG issues when we talk to our banking portfolio managers, and we don't. They're somewhere sitting in a unit somewhere, and it's really disconnected. So I think that Geneva is obviously interested, and it's completely different landscape than 10 years ago. But I also want to say that you need investors, and I'm talking about other foundations like us, talking about private individuals to really push this, because I think unless they do, it's really still quite at an early stage. So that's maybe not the most positive thing, but I do think that Geneva has the power to shift it, but we're just still at a starting stage. And maybe that's enough for now.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, thanks. If I may, I'll just add, I mean, I think the comparative advantage of the UN really is on the ground, and where we can work with different partners, whether it's embassies and the connections to governments to help build trust, to help make that risk premium be less of a perception and bring it down to its real level. So I think that's the big comparative advantage. Of course, Geneva is one of the homes of the United Nations, and so a lot of the big agencies are here, so that makes Geneva very important for us. I did want to mention one more UN organization that's relevant to all this and maybe starts to get at the scale problem, although still not with so many zeros, is the UNCDF, so UN Capital Development Fund. So there is one UN agency that does have the capacity to actually invest, hold equity, do loans, unlike the rest of our system, which is built around grants. And the project that I mentioned in Burundi, we're using UNCDF as the partner for that one. So it's something we're going to look at to see if we can't. I mean, they've been around for a long time, but I think maybe now there's a new moment to work with them more to help us bridge the sort of classic development activities into this world of private finance. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Mirko, I know you wanted to add something, so please do.
I just wanted to say something about particularly trust and risk. What, again, about experience in Mozambique, I think it was not a matter of instruments or funds. It was more a matter of trust at the end, in a sense that today we have on board the private sector. For instance, in Mozambique, they are started to consider investing in the places where the conflict was, because just a matter of trust. And they do, I would say that trust is much more important than risk, in the sense that the trust is mitigating the perception of risk. In 2019, when we were close to sign the peace agreement, this was our biggest concern. How to, first of all, let's say, give a perspective to the agreement, how to make sure that this will be considered trustful, that it is the final piece. And I remember that it was really a huge concern, because signing for everybody, as I said, seems to be the best in your life, but then in reality, the peace starts after signing. And at that moment, I remember I was so concerned, I decided to find, as I'm calling now, to try to find some champions, some people or some companies that they would trust what we were doing. And I, because I knew the company, I went to VV, to Nespresso. And I sit with them. I knew them very well since a long time. And I took them in Mozambique before signing the peace agreement. I can tell you it was amazing, the result, because Nespresso, after, it was interesting. They said, look, we trust what you are doing, and we come, even if it's high risk, because they say to me, we lost in other markets very clearly, so we know the risk, but we trust your job, you trust what you are doing. And I'm saying this because it is important, in my opinion. Creating markets and building peace is very similar, in a sense. The trust remains the base at the end of the day. And having on board just Nespresso, and now another big company, Hollard, which is a big insurance company in the southern Africa, has given trust to the project we have for the future. So we now see other companies ready to come. I remember after Nespresso went out with just a statement in LinkedIn saying, we are so happy and proud to start a project in Mozambique and so on, helping peace and so on. Just in that moment before signing the peace agreement, I started to receive phone calls from company asking me, but is it possible? Is true? Can we work there? So it was quite amazing, but very fast, also local company, they started to react and say, but if Nespresso is coming, if this one they are going there, it means that something can be done. So I think what I just would like to say, to make possible that people, they will also invest in the different instrument or bond or whatever, it is maybe also important to identify some champions that they are ready to trust the project, that they are ready to trust, to have the same vision, common goals, and then things they move. But yeah, finding some champions that they are ready to trust and forget the risk. I mean, the risk is always there. I mean, making peace and investing is more or less the same. You can always lose. Thank you.
Thank you, Mirko. I think I will now open the floor to comments and questions. Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Claude Beglet, former member of the Swiss Parliament. First question to the UN gentleman. How to organize the transition from war economy to peace economy? Of course, war is negative for the economy in general, but some type of businesses flourishes because of the war. You spoke of Colombia. I was sent there when there was the agreement with the FARC, and when we were talking with the farmers, they said, I want to continue cultivating coca, and I don't want the new system. I'm earning 5 or 6 times less than before. So how can you organize the transition from the war economy to a normal peace economy? And the question to Interpeace, I very much agree with your point on de-risking. Probably one of the ways is to create an ecosystem, as it was said. It probably also implies a coordination between the various levels of the private sector. It could be very local companies, for example, a woman to whom we give $200 and she creates a hairdressing salon. It can be a mid-sized company, 20 people in the food processing, or it could be, as you said, Nespresso in Mozambique or in Arauca or in different places, which could be somebody who wants to rebuild an infrastructure or would take advantage of the raw materials of that region. So how can you organize those 3 levels of the multinational, which brings money and skills, of the medium-sized company, which maybe reopens a business which existed before the war, and on the very, very small level, where we create some economic value to the less favored people?
Thank you very much for your question. Brian Williams, maybe you want to go first?
Sure, I was hoping you'd give me a little more time to think about it first. I mean, obviously, there's no simple answer about how you transition from a war economy to a peace economy. It's connected to how you transition from war to peace. I think the point of this panel and building bridges is that we should be, traditionally, we do that very sequentially. So traditionally, you talk about a political or a military, you talk about a military ceasefire, and then you talk about a political solution, and then you talk about everything else. And I think what we've learned through time is that we need to be working on all those things from the beginning, is what the ambassador is saying, is that even before the peace agreements, you start to bring in some of the other economic actors, the economic actors who are engaged in longer-term sustainable and also legal business. When you start talking to communities, you know, Afghanistan with opium or Myanmar with other kinds of drug trade, you often get a first instinctive response about, you know, I make more money with opium or whatever. When you start talking to communities in a little bit more depth, you discover that if the alternative is sort of just growing corn, then it doesn't feel very interesting. But if the alternative is a stable, peaceful community for their families, and if it's about, you know, services and education and real opportunity and an ability to travel and to have security and all the rest, I mean, it becomes a much more interesting proposition. Obviously, that's a complicated proposition because the pieces are all tied together, right? So we need to be working on the transparency bits, right? So whether it's about, I read an article over the weekend about cobalt in Eastern DRC, right? The blood cobalt of Eastern DRC. So whether it's about transparency around extractives, it's about engaging companies and advocating that governments talk more transparently about their relationship with economic actors and where those economic actors are going and where the proceeds of those economic actors are going. And you're talking about all of the politics, right? So you're working on democracy and media freedom and investigative journalism. And I mean, it's a multi-front war, but one shouldn't use war analogies when you're talking about peace. So you know, you need to be working on all these bits of pieces at the same time and in partnership. So sort of not in your own silo, hoping that other people are doing stuff, but explicitly in partnership with others.
Maybe you want to add something, Mr. Mazzoni?
I just want to confirm what my colleague is saying. It is exactly the big difference. Now, the economy that is developed during war is not sustainable. Simply is something that can survive till a certain extent, but does not give any perspective for the future. So the transition? I mean, working in peace is really a team building work. You need to take on board everybody. For instance, is the time after signing to start to provide services, to provide perspective of stability to these communities. And then is the package that counts. Is the fact of providing education, is the fact of providing services, is the fact of providing stability for the future, for the family, for the kids. This is very important for, in the time of war, of course you can make a lot of money, but in a short time and you are never sure. So everybody at the end is looking for stability and security for the future, not just in the short time. Of course, I think what also education for investors is important. It is important also because, you know, the return is not maybe in the short term. The return in investing in this kind of markets and context is more in the medium long term, and that is also quite important.
Thank you. And Mr. Weber, I'll let you answer the second part of the question.
Yes, thank you. Just on the de-risking at the various levels that you were talking about, you know, very often we see that companies are a little bit like a solution looking for a problem. Yeah? That, oh, I do this, therefore I'm going to try to figure out how to do that in that country. And they'll come from above, top down, and try to figure out, how do I create a market for this? Is there a market? How do I penetrate? And I think what we're talking about is, and this is where the de-risking starts, is that you start from below. You try to figure out, well, what issues are most relevant to enhancing the peace and stability of that zone of a country? Is it water? Is it lack of agriculture or the transformation of the agricultural sector? What is it? And you start working from there, and then you build an economic model from there. And I think that's the best way to de-risk. Is starting with the biggest risk is when you try to impose an idea from above and hope that it brings coherence to the ground. And I think on this panel, I don't know if you've sensed, but there are two big kind of approaches here. One is what, for example, what the ambassador is talking about is that in a very politicized peace process, how are we going to boost the effectiveness of that process so it sticks by bringing economic dividends, essentially, right? And then there's another, which is what I think Catriona and I are talking about more, and I think Brian as well, is this notion about how do you actually address the larger inequalities in society and create economic vibrancy in a society where that investment is not happening, so that it lifts all the boats and becomes more of a prevention strategy. One is kind of responding and trying to consolidate a peace that's built politically. The other one is how do you actually prevent a society from degenerating further, that social contract that is so weak in many of these societies, where people don't see the value of what the government or the economy is doing for them. How do you address that more systemic issue so that we don't have more countries that are fragile states that need a peace process to come and try to resolve the political violence? So these are two big approaches, but ultimately the answer is to start local, figure out how would that work economically? How would they buy in economically and benefit from it, and build a strategy from there?
I see there are two questions, one at the back, two at the back. So please. So I don't know who wants to take this question. Maybe Brian or William.
Maybe more questions?
Okay, so I will take more questions, and we have 5 more minutes. So
So I just want to bring another dimension. I went in a different space, Borno State in Nigeria, where you had Boko Haram conflict, humanitarian situation, Sent Mobutu in Mali, and just this summer in Italy, in Congo. So I'm talking from cases. What I think is one more issue to what you added is the fact in these areas there are so many humanitarian organizations very well needed to address everything that you have, Ebola, Boko Haram, and so on. The thing is that when peace is back, when it's back, all the teams there have no idea. They are well trained and extremely efficient in speed to deliver support for humanitarian situation. But when it comes to transition from humanitarian to development, it's just another world. And they're trying to do these things, like just what Action Against Hunger is leading a little bit in this area. But this is the main issue. So we can talk about market, financing, and everything. But if the key actors on the ground have no idea what it is transition from conflict humanitarian situation to enabling market potential. So this is something that absolutely needs to be addressed on top of everything else.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any more questions? Yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Geneva. I'm from the German Federal Foreign Office. I'm working on mediation and peace finance. Brian mentioned the peace positive investment framework that we're working on, and I'll just outline really quickly what this is about. This is about bankability on the one hand and peace impact on the other hand. And it gives you a 9-field matrix where the type of bankable peace positive investment is only one of 9 fields. The other fields are, peace neutral investments, which are bankable or only bankable with blending or never bankable, or even there are peace negative investments, which might be bankable or not bankable, but which actually have a negative impact on a conflict or on a country context. So the question is, how big is actually this one field in this 9-field matrix of peace positive bankable projects? Our impression is that we need to go beyond that, and we need to move towards bankable projects which are bankable only with blending, and we need also to take into account peace negative investments which are bankable, but which actually harm. So how do we get from peace negative bankable projects, for example, to a peace neutral or a peace positive project? So this is a dimension that I think we should also consider. So we have been talking only about this very small niche, I would say, of peace positive bankable projects, and I think we need to address the whole kind of spectrum of investments in order to make progress. So that's my question to the panelists, and maybe one specific question to Ambassador Manzoni. Looking at Mozambique, Cabo Delgado, a lot of people say that this is the prime example of a peace negative investment in liquefied natural gas onshore, which actually brought about the situation that we have. How should we have dealt with this specific type of investment in order to prevent conflict, as Scott mentioned? So how do we treat this type of asset class? Thanks.
So I don't know who wants to start. We don't have much time. You have about 2 minutes, so maybe Ambassador Manzoni, you answer the last part of the question.
Politically critical. The question of Cabo Delgado, it is a bit complex. It's true that it's not due to oil and gas. This we have to understand. Oil and gas is the last step, I would say. The problem of Cabo Delgado is a long-term issue related to governance, and I would say, unfortunately, lack of governance for many years, I would say, that created this feeling of, like in every place in the world, of exclusion, and that exclusion now became a conflict, of course. Of course, the fact of having the oil industry there has increased this feeling of exclusion, of course, and then the situation has degenerated. How to prevent is I mean, in this case, I don't have the solution, but the reality is how to prevent is to implement, I mean, to have a better governance, of course. Today, I think we are going back to the point, what package would succeed there? What proposal we can put in place in Cabo Delgado to make sure that the people, they come on board and then decide that a long-term investment in peace and in stability is better than fighting each other. That, I think, is my answer on that. Thank you.
Related to Lebanon and decentralizing maybe access to help. So what we've done quite a bit of work on one of the countries that has been mentioned, Colombia, where actually we had a very different experience from yours, where former combatants, though they know that they can get higher income from narco trafficking, have proposed to us 30 entrepreneurial projects that have nothing to do with narco trafficking. So there is a lot of entrepreneurial ideas. It's just that sometimes they don't get the resources to develop their ideas and to launch the businesses that would allow them to get out of a cycle of violence. going back to the case of Lebanon or Nigeria, what we're doing is working very closely with former combatants or affected populations to build businesses from the ground and helping them scale through digital models, investing, so that their businesses become sustainable. Because I think at the end of the day, we need both the accompaniment mechanism that has been mentioned throughout this panel with field presence and peace mediators that know what the communities have told them, that have a lot of trust, but at the same time, the idea is that development agencies do not need to stay on. So you need to build within the community the resources, the infrastructure, the companies that will allow them to exit a cycle of violence and that will provide livelihood in the long term. That means technical skill transfers, partners so that they can commercialize their products, setting up a digital infrastructure so that they can commercialize beyond national markets. If there is a higher premium, I'm thinking of products such as chocolate, coffee that can be exported and then given to bigger businesses. So I think there is the possibility to work at a local level if the peace actors do have the right level access to really go very granular, maybe beyond government structure, and that's how they can complement the work and the funding that is traditionally otherwise given by the international organizations that you've mentioned to national governments. I don't know if that answers your question. Yes, nodding.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists for being here today.
We get 30 seconds each?
30 seconds each. We all. If they take out of the, we'll see. Go ahead, please.
Just rapid fire on a few things. Absolutely, we should be supporting rule of law, capacity building and institution building. So whether it's about constitutionality or whether it's about the functioning of the judiciary is classic work of the United Nations, and we should be finding ways to, so happy to talk afterwards. Corruption, I'm glad you raised corruption. Corruption is a huge issue that exists everywhere. And you know, again, it's a little bit the same answer. We need to be working on corruption from multiple sides at the same time. I was in Albania, where corruption is a huge issue. When Shell Oil shows up, Shell Oil has an ability to engage with the government in a way that no other private actor does, and certainly not the United Nations. It's important that Shell Oil recognizes that sort of political power it has, and that it uses it to help the environment work better for everybody. So, you know, we want to be engaging that private sector, and investors are the same thing. We want to be engaging that early on. And then on humanitarian development, the answer is, in a way, a little bit the same, which is we should be doing the development work from the beginning at the same time that we're starting the humanitarian work. So if there are humanitarian needs, if people are going to die, if the international community somehow doesn't respond, of course we should be responding. But we should be responding immediately by engaging with the authorities that are there. Maybe it's local governments, maybe it's line ministries if you have problems with the central government, so that you're building their capacity to be able to both do the humanitarian and the regular services at the same time. So it's sort of a false dichotomy between those two. We need to be doing both at the same time.
Very quickly, the sir from Lebanon, I don't know what your name is, Joseph, well, you know, you're choosing one of the most complicated places in the world to try to do any of this. So I get it. But we all have sympathy for you on that. But just to say that there's a big difference, and we all who work in this field know this very well. There's a big difference between l'état légal and l'état réel. L'état légal is what you see on the surface. It's an institution of the state with ministers of this and institutions of that. And then there's the way society actually functions, which is l'état réel, which is usually a patron-client system. Lebanon they've perfected it in Lebanon, the patron-client system. But it's the case in many countries. And what peace builders are particularly good at is understanding l'état réel and the way society actually functions. And so your ability, and Claude Begley, who's here, has probably visited more countries than all of us combined. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Each of these countries has a surface level coherence, and behind it is the reality of how things work. And often businesses, and coming to Bjorn's question about the 9 categories, which I'm very interested in, of course we're talking about peace positive investments. I mean, that's where the standards are so key. And the standards about how you engage are going to be what keeps things in that category versus the others. But I can say, having worked with the private sector in many countries, most of them are either peace blind, peace naive, or just don't give a crap, frankly. And so they are taking massive risks by not even asking themselves these questions. And so I think we are in a different category of figuring out now, with a lot more skills being brought to this equation. As Achim said, there's a lot more focus now and creativity happening in this, but it's also bringing the skills to understand l'état réel, the real situation in the country, where those opportunities are, and how you can make sure that whatever is being done, and there's a lot of opportunity to actually recycle other kinds of investments by adding these peace-enhancing mechanisms and make them more peace-positive. So there is a way of shifting current investments from other categories you were mentioning into the peace-positive category. But it's about having the right standards and the right expertise to accompany them. Thanks.
I think we'll take these positive words. You wanted to ask? No, I'm sorry. So we'll take these positive words as the final words. And I thank you all the panelists for being here today. Thank you very much. And thank you all of you for being in this room today and for your questions to them.